They were two of the most unforgettable voices of the 1960s, rebellious, electrifying, and seemingly fated to burn bright and fast. On stage, they were untouchable legends. But behind the curtain, that's where the story takes a darker, more unsettling turn. Everyone knew Janis Joplin for her wild spirit, her fearless attitude, and her refusal to apologize for who she was. Yet few are aware that there was one fellow rock star she utterly despised, Jim Morrison, and for reasons that go far beyond simple artistic rivalry. Their very first meeting wasn't just a collision of two powerful personalities. It was a disturbing encounter that left a lasting mark. For years, the incident was spoken of in hushed tones, chalked up to the excesses of rock and roll, and left to fade into myth. But newly uncovered information reveals a chilling side to the story, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about these two musical giants. What follows is more than shocking. It's unforgettable. Janis Lyn Joplin grew up in Port Arthur, Texas, a town steeped in tradition, where deviation from the norm wasn't just frowned upon, it was punished. Janis didn't merely stand out. She lived in defiance of everything the town represented. Even as a child, she gravitated toward artistic and musical influences that went far beyond what was expected of a Southern girl. While her peers favored pop hits and country melodies, Janis found solace in the raw emotional expressions of blues legends like Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and Lead Belly. These voices told stories of suffering and survival that resonated with her deeply. But Port Arthur didn't just fail to embrace her differences. It made a brutal sport out of crushing them. In school, Janis was tormented relentlessly. Her acne, her ever-changing weight, her nonconformist wardrobe, all were targeted by peers eager to tear her down. This wasn't simple childhood teasing. It was deeply personal, cruel psychological bullying that scarred her. She refused to stay silent, often voicing support for ideas that challenged the norms of her community, including racial integration, an unthinkable stance in her deeply segregated town. Her courage only isolated her further. Hoping to find belonging, she enrolled at Lamar State College of Technology and later at the University of Texas at Austin. She dreamed of finding a place where her talents would be appreciated and her uniqueness respected. But Austin proved no kinder. She became known for wandering barefoot, dressed in men's shirts, carrying her auto harp from one coffeehouse to another. Her individuality was again met with cruelty, culminating in a devastating moment when a university fraternity voted her ugliest man on campus. The emotional wounds inflicted by constant ridicule never fully healed, but instead became the fuel that ignited her musical power. When Janis sang, she did so with an intensity that made listeners feel every ounce of pain, rage, and resilience inside her. Her voice didn't strive for perfection. It exploded with raw, heartfelt truth. She didn't just perform the blues, she embodied them. Each performance became a form of defiance, an act of survival, a declaration of her worth in a world that had tried to erase her. Her music connected deeply with anyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. Her entire career became her response to those who tried to silence her, a way to carve out her identity in sound, volume, and vulnerability. As her pain followed her into adulthood, Janis began to lean on a different kind of comfort, one that would prove to be both her solace and her undoing. For Janis, Southern comfort wasn't merely an alcoholic beverage. It was practically a stage prop, a ritual, a symbol of her identity. With her iconic rose-colored glasses, eclectic wardrobe, and that unforgettably raspy voice, she often walked onto the stage with a bottle of Southern comfort in her grasp, as if it were an extension of herself. Whether it was a massive festival like Woodstock or an intimate club gig, that bottle was always nearby. It wasn't just for show. Janis drank from it mid-performance, using it to soothe her nerves and enhance the emotional ferocity of her delivery. She didn't drink cautiously or modestly. She did it with the same boldness that defined her entire life. There's a twist, though. While many, including Janis herself, believed Southern comfort was a type of whiskey, it actually wasn't. At least not in the traditional sense. For much of its existence, it was more of a liqueur, made from neutral grain spirits and flavored with fruit and spices, resembling vodka more than true bourbon. Yet none of that mattered to Janis. She was frequently seen with the bottle backstage, on buses, or at press events, its presence as constant as her music. Southern Comfort became so synonymous with her image that it inadvertently became part of her personal brand. The drink's manufacturers noticed. Without ever paying her a cent, they realized Janis was their greatest and most defiant ambassador. As a token of their appreciation, they sent her a lavish lynx fur coat and matching hat. In the flamboyant world of the late 1960s, such a gift wasn't just about fashion, it was about status. Janis, who often felt unattractive or unwanted, wore the coat with unguarded pride. But like many of the icons and artifacts woven into her legend, Southern Comfort came with a heavy price. The same drink that helped her face the spotlight also dimmed her internal light. Her reliance on alcohol was more than a habit. It was a crutch for deeper insecurities and the heavy burden of fame. It dulled her anguish, warmed her in moments of loneliness, and slowly eroded the strength she poured into every performance. In time, her dependence on it, and other substances, contributed to her untimely death at just 27 years old. Despite her image as a wild child and symbol of countercultural freedom, Janis's love life was marked by heartbreak and longing. While she captivated the world with her fierce presence and magnetic performances, in private, she yearned for love with just as much fervor. Yet, that deep craving for connection often went unfulfilled. Her romantic relationships were usually fleeting and stormy, intense flares of passion that ended in disillusionment. She approached love with the same vulnerability and raw energy that defined her music, and all too often, she was the one left abandoned. Some partners were entranced by her genius, but overwhelmed by her intensity. Others were more interested in her rising fame than in who she truly was. Again and again she offered her heart, only to find indifference, betrayal, or distance in return. Perhaps the most poignant example of this emotional struggle occurred in 1968, when she shared a brief moment of intimacy with Leonard Cohen at the Chelsea Hotel in New York. Cohen later reflected on the encounter with detached poetic melancholy, referencing it in his well-known song, Chelsea Hotel No. 2. For Janis, it was another fleeting connection in a life filled with momentary loves and enduring loneliness. What passed as a fleeting, almost forgettable moment for him stayed with Janis far longer, weighing heavily on her. She might have gone out that evening in search of Chris Christopherson, but ended up settling for whatever company was around, a circumstance that casts a shadow of sorrow over the entire episode. Years later, Leonard Cohen would reflect on the song he wrote, suddenly unsure of how he felt about including Janis by name. Only in hindsight did he grasp that what had simply been artistic expression for him may have been a much more personal, emotional moment for her. That night, like many in her romantic life, closed with a sense of disappointment. Her experiences with love rarely ended well, and that recurring heartbreak didn't just color her private life, it poured directly into her art. Songs like Piece of My Heart, Cry Baby, and Maybe weren't just tracks, they were emotional declarations, filled with the raw, aching emptiness that love sometimes leaves behind. That deep emotional vulnerability was more than just a trait. It was her trademark, wounded, imperfect, and profoundly relatable. It was this unfiltered sincerity that made her voice soar into the hearts of listeners who had known the sharp sting of rejection or held on to the hope that love might finally deliver them. With every note she sang, Janis Joplin pulled back the curtain on her fame and flamboyance to reveal a woman from Texas who yearned to be embraced, and who never fully believed she deserved it. Fame never healed the parts of Janis that were already hurting. Instead, it intensified those inner struggles. Before anyone knew her name, she was already locked in a fight with substance abuse, often turning to alcohol and stimulants to numb her emotional distress. But once she rose to fame, first as the electrifying frontwoman of Big Brother and the Holding Company, and then as a solo artist, her reliance on drugs deepened. Heroin in particular became a constant companion. Her rising success did nothing to dispel her sense of loneliness and low self-worth. In fact, it made them worse. People closest to her watched helplessly as the magnetic performer who could light up an entire arena became increasingly withdrawn when the stage lights went off. Bonds began to fray under the pressure of her unpredictable behavior, and the wild lifestyle that once gave her a sense of control slowly drained her spirit. Janis made sincere attempts to get clean more than once. At one point in the mid-1960s, she even left the San Francisco scene to return to Texas in an effort to reset and regain stability. But the gravitational pull of the music world, and all that came with it, was too strong to resist. She found herself back in California, back in the limelight, and quickly fell into old patterns. Though there were brief spells of hope and moments of clarity, they never lasted. In her final months, she was working on what would become her most celebrated solo record, Pearl, and those around her had begun to feel optimistic. Still, behind the curtain, she had quietly returned to using heroin. Then, on October 4th, 1970, just a couple of weeks after the death of Jimi Hendrix, Janis was found lifeless in her Hollywood hotel room from an overdose. She was only 27. Her untimely death sealed her place in the annals of rock history, not just as a powerhouse vocalist, but also as one of the earliest members of the so-called 27 Club, a tragic group of iconic musicians who died at the age of 27. Janis's story would be echoed in the lives of Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, and others, symbolizing the steep cost of celebrity and the fragile humanity that often hides behind extraordinary talent. Her death captured public attention in a way that sometimes overshadows the rich complexity of her life. She was never a stereotype. She wasn't merely a casualty of the 60s. She was a deeply perceptive, emotionally wounded woman who had a message to share, and she delivered it in a way no one else ever could. Perhaps the cruelest twist of fate is that Pearl, the album she never got to complete, turned out to be her most refined and emotionally powerful body of work. Released posthumously in 1971, it featured soul-stirring tracks like Me and Bobby McGee and Mercedes-Benz, songs that showcased her signature blend of biting humor and aching openness. Today, the album stands among rock's most treasured recordings, serving as a haunting testament to what was lost and what might have been. Janis gave everything she had to her music, right down to the depths of her soul. Her life ended far too early, but the emotion, intensity, and grit she infused into her performances still ripple through time, touching listeners who feel her presence in every lyric. Janis Joplin didn't just draw influence from the blues. She was part of its very soul. Of all the legendary figures who shaped her musical identity, none stood taller in her eyes than Bessie Smith, the iconic African-American blues singer hailed as the Empress of the Blues. Bessie's voice resonated with Janis on an intensely personal level, offering not only artistic direction, but also a sense of emotional solidarity. Growing up in a conservative, often judgmental town where she was mocked for being different, Janis found in Bessie a kindred spirit, someone unafraid to express her pain, defiance, and vulnerability through music. Janis didn't just admire her. She considered Bessie a spiritual forebear, a voice from another life that gave her permission to scream, cry, and bare her soul. Half in jest, she once mused that she might be Bessie's reincarnation. Despite being separated by race and time, their paths bore uncanny similarities. Both were outsiders in their respective worlds. Both turned heartache into powerful music, and both saw their lives cut short before their time. Janis's emotional connection to Bessie became even more personal when she discovered that Smith had been buried in 1937 without a headstone. The blues legend had died after being refused care at a whites-only hospital in Mississippi, a cruel reminder of the era's racial injustice. Despite all she had achieved and the legacy she left behind, Bessie had been denied even a proper grave marker. To Janis, this wasn't merely a historical oversight, it was an outrage. Determined to right that wrong, Janis sprang into action. In 1970, she partnered with Juanita Green, a woman who had once worked for Bessie and knew her personally, to co-fund a gravestone. Together, they ensured that Bessie Smith would finally receive the recognition she so richly deserved. The headstone, though simple, delivered a message that echoed far beyond the cemetery gates. The greatest blues singer in the world will never stop singing. It was more than a tribute. It was a declaration. To Janis, Bessie's legacy had never truly ended. Her voice still lived on in the music, in the pain, and in every woman brave enough to live loudly, feel deeply, and refuse to apologize for it. Honoring Bessie Smith's grave was more than a gesture of gratitude. It was an act of justice. For Janis, it was unthinkable to allow someone who had meant so much to be forgotten by the world. She understood too well what it felt like to be ridiculed, dismissed, or misunderstood. In that moment, she used her platform not to elevate herself, but to bring long overdue attention to a trailblazer history had nearly erased. While Janis paid tribute to one blues legend with heartfelt sincerity, her encounter with another so-called icon left her not only enraged, but profoundly changed. For years, Jim Morrison has been wrapped in an aura of myth, an enigmatic blend of poet, rock idol, and tormented genius. However, recent disclosures are causing fans and biographers alike to confront a far more unsettling reality beneath the carefully curated legend. The 2025 documentary series Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison, delves into this shadowy territory, presenting insights from those who knew Morrison intimately and revealing alarming truths about his behavior. Among the most compelling voices in the series is Judy Huddleston, a former partner of Morrison's, who brings forward disturbing claims of sexual misconduct. Her account exposes a man who could shift from affectionate to menacing in an instant. According to Huddleston, Morrison once forcibly restrained and assaulted her, ignoring her repeated objections. She described the frightening shift in his demeanor, claiming his eyes turned black with fury as he descended into a violent state. Her recollections imply that Morrison's outbursts were not merely fueled by substances, but stemmed from something deeply dangerous and uncontrolled. Huddleston's association with Morrison began in the late 1960s, after a backstage meeting at one of his concerts. Over the course of 4 years, she became entangled in a relationship marked by emotional manipulation. Through interviews and her memoir Love Him Madly, she reflects on the psychological toll it took on her, clinging to the belief that she could help him change, all the while enduring a cycle of hope and hurt. What she eventually recognized wasn't an impassioned love affair, but a sequence of abusive behaviors, both mental and physical. Morrison's magnetic chaos may have drawn people in, but those closest to him often paid the highest price. Behind his poetic persona, he reportedly maintained power through fear and coercion. There are other troubling stories involving Morrison and women from that era. Pamela Des Barres, a familiar figure from the 1960s rock scene, once recalled how Morrison slapped her across the face at the Whiskey A Go-Go, apparently without provocation. John Densmore, drummer for The Doors and Morrison's frequent collaborator, has also spoken about unsettling incidents, one involving Morrison brandishing a knife at a woman and forcefully grabbing her. For decades, these incidents were brushed aside or glamorized as part of the chaotic excess of rock and roll culture. However, through the lens of today's conversations about abuse of power and accountability, these stories take on a much darker and more serious significance. The damage Morrison inflicted went far beyond his own self-destruction. Those in his orbit, especially women, often bore the brunt of his erratic and aggressive behavior. As more light is shed on these unsettling stories, it casts a shadow over all the old narratives, reframing events that were once dismissed as wild, romantic legends. Even the infamous clash between Morrison and Janis Joplin, long reduced to a wild celebrity tale, now feels far more sinister. For years, their altercation was told as a spirited clash between two strong personalities, drenched in alcohol and ego. But in hindsight, it appears to be yet another instance of Morrison's troubling behavior. The commonly recounted version of that evening suggests that Janis retaliated against Morrison's unwanted aggression by smashing a bottle of Southern Comfort over his head. What once sounded like outrageous diva antics now registers as a desperate act of self-protection. Morrison's mistreatment of her wasn't an isolated incident. It fit into a broader and disturbing pattern that is only now being fully recognized. Though Morrison remains an emblem of 1960s rebellion, his legacy is now seen in a far more nuanced and troubling light, challenging the glamorized mythology that surrounded him for decades. Their first meeting had all the makings of a rock and roll fairy tale, or at least something worthy of a movie script. Paul Rothchild, the renowned producer who had worked with both Janis Joplin and The Doors, was eager to introduce them. The idea of uniting the so-called king and queen of rock thrilled him. Both were intense, charismatic forces within the counterculture scene, and Rothchild imagined their meeting sparking creative and romantic fireworks, To bring them together, he organized a private party in Hidden Hills, a secluded enclave just outside Los Angeles that allowed for both intimacy and wildness. Surprisingly, both Janice and Jim arrived sober, a rarity for either at the time. Initially, the atmosphere between them was electric. Morrison seemed instantly taken with Janice, reportedly calling her remarkable, while Janice appeared intrigued by his rugged looks and rock star mystique. Their conversation flowed, filled with laughter and apparent mutual curiosity. Yet in a world driven by instability, that initial connection ignited not romance but something far more volatile. As the night progressed, Morrison's notorious drinking caught up with him. What had begun as harmless flirtation quickly soured. Known for drinking himself into a stupor, Morrison began transforming into the version of himself that even his close friends dreaded. Rothschild, familiar with these spirals, later described Morrison's shift as descending into something vulgar and unpleasant. Janice, though known for her own drinking, tended to become more exuberant and lovable rather than hostile. The contrast between their behaviors became glaring as Morrison's actions grew increasingly inappropriate and unsettling. As Jim's behavior escalated, his remarks becoming cruder and more aggressive, Janice began visibly withdrawing. The more she tried to distance herself, the more Jim pursued her, almost as if he derived satisfaction from her discomfort. It seemed he treated resistance as a challenge rather than a boundary. Rothschild, who had once been excited by the idea of their meeting, could see that things were taking a dangerous turn. What he had hoped would be a memorable encounter between two legends was rapidly devolving into something toxic. By the time the gathering came to a close, whatever potential had existed between Janice and Jim had soured entirely. Janice, fed up with Morrison's behavior, told Rothschild she was done and planned to leave in her station wagon, the one she often used as her personal escape. As she prepared to depart, Morrison, clearly intoxicated and unwilling to let the night end, stumbled toward her. Slurring his words and defiant, he reached into the car and yanked on her hair in a drunken attempt to stop her. That was the breaking point. Without hesitation, Janice grabbed a nearby bottle of Southern Comfort and smashed it over Morrison's head. The bottle shattered on impact, leaving Morrison unconscious and bleeding. The so-called Lizard King lay dazed and disgraced, while Janice, for one clear and empowering moment, reclaimed her dignity. In a night that had spiraled into something ugly, that act was a final declaration. She belonged to no one, and she would not be taken lightly. What began as a misguided attempt at matchmaking by Paul Rothschild had spiraled into one of the most explosive personal clashes in the annals of rock history. In an ambitious attempt to spark chemistry between two of the most captivating icons in rock music, Rothschild arranged a get-together in Hidden Hills, Los Angeles, bringing Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin face-to-face for the first time. On paper, it was a historic fusion, the crowned prince and princess of psychedelic rock converging at one electrifying moment. But as the liquor began to flow, with Southern Comfort and whiskey fueling the atmosphere, Morrison's darker tendencies quickly rose to the surface. He was infamous for his erratic drinking habits and combative demeanor, and rather than simply connecting with Janice, he bombarded her with relentless and intrusive advances, lacking any semblance of grace or respect. Janice, who had already sensed danger in the air, attempted to remove herself from the increasingly volatile environment. As she made her way to the band's station wagon, Morrison, intoxicated and aggressive, lurched after her and, in a startling display of drunken bravado, seized a chunk of her hair, pulling her back toward him with a caveman-like fury. That was the final straw. Janice, known for her refusal to be belittled or bullied, instinctively reached for the closest object within reach. A bottle of Southern Comfort, her signature drink both on and off stage. With a surge of fury and clarity, she spun around and shattered the bottle over Morrison's head. The glass exploded, Morrison crumpled, and the stunned partygoers were left speechless by the sheer intensity of the confrontation. This wasn't your average drunken scuffle. It was a raw, unapologetic act of resistance, as Morrison lay either dazed or completely knocked out, depending on who you ask. Janice slid into the driver's seat of her band's vehicle, her expression fierce and unyielding. To her, the incident wasn't merely a rejection of a man who wouldn't take no for an answer. It was a declaration. She would not be manhandled, manipulated, or dismissed like some backstage tag-along. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire ordeal was Morrison's inability, or refusal, to comprehend the gravity of what had just transpired. Rothschild later recalled that Morrison turned up to rehearsals the following day, still obsessed with Janice, still asking for her number, still rambling about how amazing she was. His version of events seemed twisted, almost as though he viewed the assault not as a catastrophe, but as just another chapter in his perpetual narrative of domination and destruction. But for Janice, that chaotic night was a verdict. She made it crystal clear to those around her that she wanted no further involvement with Jim Morrison. Though she never broadcasted the incident publicly in great detail, her inner circle understood her position without question. That shattered bottle wasn't merely glass. It was a line that, once crossed, demanded consequences. Some claim that Hidden Hills wasn't the only place where Janice was forced to physically fend off Morrison. Another infamous tale, steeped in the hazy lore of rock history, allegedly unfolded at the Scene nightclub in Manhattan. There, amid the throbbing energy of a packed venue, Janice, Morrison, and Jimi Hendrix were caught in a whirlwind of madness. According to those who were there, Morrison, true to his wild form, began acting out during Hendrix's set, creating chaos on stage. Janice, incensed by the disruption, reportedly struck Morrison with another bottle before dousing him with her drink, all in plain view of a stunned audience. What followed, witnesses said, was a surreal blur of broken glass, feathers, and sweat, an entangled mass of iconic musicians locked in a psychedelic frenzy that defied belief. The night Morrison yanked Janice by the hair and was met with a retaliatory blow to the skull wasn't just a violent episode amid the madness of the 60s. It was a pivotal turning point. From that point onward, Janice distanced herself completely from Morrison. Whatever fascination she might have once held for him evaporated in that instant. She didn't just walk away angry, she walked away resolved. Morrison, to her, was no longer an eccentric artist spiraling in his own excess. He had exposed himself as someone dangerous, entitled, and symbolic of everything Janice had spent her life resisting. While others might have dismissed the event as just another outrageous night among rock stars, Janice internalized it as something much deeper. She refused to collaborate with Morrison, avoided him socially, and, above all else, never forgave or forgot. Morrison was no longer just another problematic man. To Janice, he embodied a larger, insidious force that had long worked to silence women like her. He was the embodiment of that destructive male genius trope, celebrated for his chaos, revered for his madness, while Janice, for all her brilliance, was torn apart for her own demons. She had seen this double standard before. While Morrison's reckless behavior was romanticized as tortured brilliance, her pain and self-medication were used to diminish her. He could destroy and be exalted. She could suffer and be dismissed. That imbalance burned in her. Morrison was not just a man who crossed a line. He symbolized the broader misogyny of an industry that constantly minimized women no matter how talented they were. Janice knew her own worth, and she knew the world often refused to see it. Still, in the face of such disrespect, rejection, and anger, Janice didn't fade away. She alchemized her pain into something enduring. Her legacy wasn't just about a remarkable voice. It was about the emotional rawness and truth she injected into every word, every cry, every trembling note. Her vocals weren't sterile or technically pristine. They were thunderous, vulnerable, and soul-deep. Whether she was belting out "Piece of My Heart" or mourning through "Little Girl Blue," she wasn't simply performing. She was revealing herself, bleeding on stage for all to see. In a world that told women to be neat, small, and silent, Janice stood tall, chaotic, and real. She gave voice to everyone who felt invisible, unloved, or unheard. More than 50 years after her passing, Janis Joplin remains a monumental figure. Not just because of her vocal power, but because she dared to exist loudly and unapologetically in a world that tried to erase her. She remains a warning of how fame can consume even the fiercest souls, but she also shines as a symbol of fierce authenticity. Through her fury, through her voice, through every guttural scream, she left more than a musical imprint. She left a legacy of rebellion and emotional honesty that refuses to be silenced. Her story resonates deeply because it's not just history, it's still heartbreakingly relevant. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe for more untold stories from music's wild past, and let us know in the comments. What's your take on what really happened between Janice and Jim? And don't go anywhere. Click the next video on your screen for another unforgettable deep dive into the strange, chaotic, and iconic world of rock and roll. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.